Your soulmate's silence is about to end, God promised. My beloved child, don't skip. Listen carefully, because this fictional story begins in a season where silence has lasted longer than either heart expected. Days have turned into weeks, weeks into months, and every sunrise has arrived carrying the same unanswered questions. Yet beneath that silence, something remarkable has been taking place. This is not a prediction about your life or someone else's. It is a fictional story about hope, faith, healing, and discovering that the quietest seasons often prepare us for the most meaningful conversations. There was a time when one person believed silence would protect them. They convinced themselves that hiding their emotions would prevent disappointment. They buried themselves in work, surrounded themselves with distractions, and smiled whenever someone asked how they were doing. But every evening, when the world became still, the same memories returned. A familiar laugh echoed through their thoughts. A meaningful conversation replayed in their mind. A simple act of kindness refused to be forgotten. They slowly realized that silence had not erased what they felt. It had only delayed the honesty their heart had been asking for all along. As another peaceful dawn painted the sky with shades of gold and blue, they stepped outside into the cool morning air. They whispered a quiet prayer, asking not for immediate answers but for the wisdom to do what was right. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance did not arrive through dramatic signs or extraordinary events. It came through a growing conviction to choose truth instead of fear, forgiveness instead of resentment, and compassion instead of pride. That gentle change within their heart became stronger with each passing day until they could no longer ignore it. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. Meanwhile, the other person was also changing in ways no one could see. They had spent so much time wondering why life had unfolded the way it had that they almost overlooked the lessons hidden within every difficult season. They began appreciating family more deeply, expressing gratitude more often, and understanding that meaningful relationships are built through honesty, patience, and mutual respect. Looking back, they realized the silence had not been empty. It had quietly transformed both hearts into people who were far wiser, gentler, and more compassionate than before. One quiet evening, while watching the sun disappear beyond the horizon, the person who had remained silent for so long finally admitted something to themselves. They were no longer afraid of being honest. They understood that living with endless regret was far heavier than speaking with humility. They knew they could not control another person's response, but they could control whether they acted with integrity. That realization lifted a burden they had carried for months. For the first time in a long while, they felt genuine peace. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its greatest truths. Sometimes what feels like God's promise in a story is really the enduring invitation to choose love over fear, honesty over avoidance, and hope over despair. Whether that guidance comes through prayer, quiet reflection, wise counsel, or the gentle prompting of conscience, it encourages people to become the kind of person who brings healing rather than hurt. The greatest miracle is often the courage to begin an honest conversation with kindness and respect. As another sunrise illuminated the earth, both people stepped into the day carrying hearts that had been changed by patience. They no longer wanted to win arguments or protect their pride. They wanted to live with sincerity. Every act of forgiveness had prepared them for understanding. Every lesson had prepared them for wisdom. Every season of waiting had prepared them to value truth more than comfort. Whatever happened next, they knew they would face it with grace rather than fear. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because they lead directly into the next unforgettable chapter of this fictional journey. The silence was no longer a prison. It had become a classroom where two hearts learned compassion, humility, and faith. And as the golden light of a brand new morning stretched across the horizon, they quietly realized that the most powerful conversations are not born from pressure or certainty. They are born from hearts transformed by love, guided by hope, and strengthened by the courage to finally speak the truth with kindness. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the silence that once seemed endless was beginning to reveal why it had lasted so long. Listen carefully, because there are moments in life when two people believe distance means the story is over, when unanswered messages, unfinished conversations, and quiet days appear to signal the end of something meaningful. Yet in this fictional journey, the silence had never been the true ending. It had become a season of preparation, where both hearts were learning lessons they could not have understood if everything had happened according to their own plans. As another beautiful sunrise spread across the horizon, the person who had remained silent stood by the window, watching the morning light slowly fill the room. They remembered every moment they had almost reached for the phone, every message they had typed and erased, every conversation they had imagined but never allowed to happen. Fear had whispered that honesty would only bring disappointment. Pride had suggested that silence was safer than vulnerability. But after many months of reflection, they finally understood that avoiding the truth had not protected their heart. It had only delayed the peace that comes from living with sincerity. The quiet guidance they felt in this fictional story gently reminded them that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing to do what is right even while uncertainty remains. Throughout that day, ordinary moments carried extraordinary meaning. A familiar song played unexpectedly while they were driving home. They smiled, not because they believed it was a sign of what would happen next, but because it reminded them of the importance of gratitude for every meaningful memory. Later, they noticed an elderly couple walking hand in hand through a nearby park, laughing together after many years. That simple scene reminded them that lasting relationships are not built upon perfect circumstances. They are built through patience, forgiveness, understanding, and the willingness to keep choosing kindness even after difficult seasons. The more they reflected upon those lessons, the more they desired to become someone who could bring peace rather than conflict into every relationship. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional center of this fictional story quietly unfolds here. Meanwhile, the other person was also experiencing quiet growth. During the months of silence, they had learned to value themselves in healthier ways. They no longer believed that their happiness depended entirely upon another person's choices. Instead, they invested time in strengthening friendships, serving their community, caring for family, and becoming more grateful for the blessings already surrounding them. They discovered that personal growth is never wasted. Every lesson learned in solitude prepared them to build stronger relationships in the future, whether with old friends, new companions, or family members who needed encouragement. As evening settled across the landscape, both hearts, separated by distance but united by similar lessons, looked toward the same sunset without knowing it. The brilliant colors stretching across the sky reminded them that every day ends with the promise of another sunrise. They realized that hope is not sustained by knowing exactly what tomorrow holds. Hope grows through trusting that every day offers another opportunity to choose integrity, compassion, humility, and love. The fears that had once controlled them no longer held the same power because they had learned that peace comes from acting with honesty rather than hiding behind uncertainty. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its most meaningful truths. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not a guarantee that every relationship would unfold exactly as they imagined. Instead, it was the quiet invitation to become people whose words reflected truth, whose actions reflected kindness, and whose hearts remained open to forgiveness. Sometimes the greatest answer is not receiving immediate certainty. Sometimes it is becoming the kind of person who can face any outcome with grace, wisdom, and unwavering faith. As another dawn illuminated the horizon, they welcomed the morning with peaceful hearts. They no longer feared silence because they understood that it had taught them how to listen more carefully, love more deeply, and appreciate every genuine connection more sincerely. Every challenge had strengthened their character. Every unanswered question had increased their patience. Every difficult season had quietly shaped them into people capable of building relationships founded upon trust rather than fear. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional story will reveal the moment when quiet reflection begins giving way to honest conversation. The journey was no longer about waiting for someone else to change first. It had become a journey of becoming the best version of themselves. And as the golden light stretched across another beautiful morning, both hearts stepped forward carrying renewed courage, quiet hope, and the understanding that every act of honesty, every gesture of forgiveness, and every choice to love with compassion has the power to open doors that fear could never unlock. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the silence that once felt permanent was beginning to crack in ways neither heart could have imagined. Listen carefully, because there comes a moment when pretending becomes more exhausting than telling the truth. For a long time, one heart had carried words that were never spoken, apologies that were never expressed, and gratitude that was never shared. They believed silence would protect everyone from disappointment, yet with every passing day they realized that silence had become its own burden. The longer they remained quiet, the more they understood that honesty, even when difficult, brings a peace that hiding never can. As dawn slowly painted the sky with brilliant shades of gold, soft orange, and gentle blue, they sat alone with a warm cup of coffee, watching the world awaken. The birds greeted the morning without fear, the breeze moved freely through the trees, and the sunlight reached every corner of the landscape without hesitation. They quietly reflected on how nature never struggles to fulfill its purpose. That simple thought inspired them to stop resisting the quiet invitation they had been feeling for so long. In this fictional story, they understood God's guidance not as a dramatic command, but as the steady encouragement to live with truth, humility, compassion, and courage. Throughout the day, memories returned one after another. They remembered conversations that ended too soon, moments when kindness could have been expressed more clearly, and opportunities that had been lost because fear had spoken louder than love. Yet instead of allowing regret to overwhelm them, they chose to see every memory as a lesson. They realized that the past could not be rewritten, but the future could still be shaped by the decisions they made today. That realization filled them with quiet determination. They no longer wished to remain trapped inside yesterday's mistakes. They wanted to become someone whose words brought healing instead of hesitation. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional center of this fictional story grows even stronger here. Meanwhile, the other person had also reached a place of unexpected peace. They no longer spent every day wondering why the silence had lasted so long. Instead, they invested their energy in becoming healthier emotionally and spiritually. They strengthened friendships, devoted more time to family, discovered new passions, and learned that their value had never depended upon another person's decisions. Without realizing it, they had become stronger than they had ever imagined. Their confidence was no longer built upon receiving reassurance from others. It was rooted in gratitude, integrity, and quiet faith. As evening arrived, both hearts looked toward the same sunset from different places. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring, yet both sensed that fear no longer deserved to guide their lives. The silence that once seemed like a wall had become a bridge leading them toward greater wisdom. They understood that if an honest conversation were ever to happen, it should come from genuine humility rather than desperation, from respect rather than pressure, and from compassion rather than expectation. Whatever the outcome, they wanted their words to leave behind peace rather than regret. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares one of its most beautiful lessons. In this story, what feels like God's promise is not a guarantee of a particular ending. It is the assurance that hearts shaped by patience, forgiveness, honesty, and love will never waste the lessons they have learned. Even if the road ahead remains uncertain, choosing truth instead of fear is always a meaningful step. Every sincere act of kindness, every humble apology, every moment of forgiveness, and every courageous conversation plants seeds that can grow into something beautiful over time. As another sunrise appeared beyond the distant hills, they welcomed the new day with peaceful hearts. For the first time in many months, neither person felt controlled by uncertainty. They understood that the future is built through faithful choices made today. Every sunrise became another invitation to encourage instead of criticize, to forgive instead of resent, to speak honestly instead of remaining silent, and to trust that living with integrity will always bring lasting peace. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal the moment when silence finally gives way to words that have waited far too long to be spoken. The season of waiting was nearing its end. The lessons had been learned. The hearts had been softened. And as the golden morning light stretched across the earth once again, both people stepped forward carrying courage they once believed they would never possess, trusting that whatever happened next, they would face it with grace, wisdom, and hope. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the moment both hearts had unknowingly been preparing for was drawing closer with every passing sunrise. Listen carefully, because there are seasons when nothing seems to happen on the outside while everything is changing within. The silence that once felt like an unbreakable wall had slowly become a bridge built through patience, reflection, and personal growth. Neither person could have imagined that the very season they once wanted to escape would become the season that transformed them into wiser, gentler, and more compassionate people. As the first light of dawn spread across the horizon, the one who had remained silent for so long found themselves waking earlier than usual. They sat quietly by the window, watching the golden sunlight slowly chase away the darkness. For the first time in many months, they were not overwhelmed by fear or regret. Instead, they felt a quiet determination growing stronger within their heart. In this fictional story, they understood God's guidance as the steady encouragement to stop allowing fear to write the next chapter of their life. They realized that courage does not guarantee a perfect outcome, but it allows a person to live without the heavy burden of wondering, what if I had simply been honest? Throughout the day, memories continued to return, but they no longer brought pain alone. They brought gratitude. They remembered laughter shared during simple moments, conversations that offered comfort during difficult days, and the quiet support that had once made ordinary life feel extraordinary. Rather than wishing they could return to the past, they began appreciating those memories for the lessons they carried. Every joyful moment had shown them the value of gratitude. Every misunderstanding had taught the importance of communication. Every season of silence had revealed how precious genuine connection truly is. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional center of this fictional story quietly unfolds here. Meanwhile, the other person had also reached a place of unexpected peace. They had stopped searching for constant reassurance from the outside and had begun building confidence from within. They learned to celebrate their own growth, to treasure healthy friendships, and to appreciate the quiet blessings that filled each ordinary day. They no longer believed their future depended entirely on one conversation. Instead, they trusted that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it with honesty, grace, and compassion. That quiet confidence became one of the greatest gifts they had ever received. As evening settled over the landscape, both people looked toward the same sunset from different places. The sky glowed with breathtaking colors, reminding them that every ending also prepares the way for another beginning. In the stillness of that evening, the one who had remained silent finally reached for the phone. Their hand paused for a moment as old fears returned, whispering familiar doubts. But those fears no longer controlled them. They took a slow breath, smiled gently, and realized that speaking with sincerity was no longer something to fear. Whether the conversation would lead to reconciliation, understanding, or simply peaceful closure, they knew that truth spoken with kindness would always be worthwhile. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its most meaningful truths. In this story, what they experienced as God's promise was never about guaranteeing a particular ending. It was about faithfully shaping hearts until they became capable of choosing forgiveness instead of resentment, humility instead of pride, and hope instead of despair. The greatest miracle was not that every obstacle disappeared. The greatest miracle was that fear had finally lost its power over two hearts willing to grow. As another beautiful sunrise painted the sky with brilliant shades of gold and blue, they welcomed the morning with peaceful hearts. They understood that life is too precious to leave important words forever unspoken. Every sunrise became another reminder that kindness should never be delayed, gratitude should never remain hidden, and forgiveness should never be postponed. They stepped into the day carrying hope rather than hesitation, ready to embrace whatever chapter awaited them with faith, integrity, and compassion. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal the conversation that changes everything. The silence had served its purpose. The lessons had been learned. The hearts had been transformed. And as the morning light stretched across the earth once again, the first honest words were finally ready to be spoken, words shaped not by fear, but by humility, wisdom, and a love that had grown stronger through every season of waiting. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the silence that had stretched across so many seasons was finally interrupted by one small act of courage. Listen carefully, because life is often changed not by dramatic events but by a single decision made with honesty. The person who had spent countless nights wondering whether they should reach out looked at the phone resting quietly on the table. Their heart raced, their hands trembled, and every old fear tried to convince them to wait one more day. Yet deep inside, they understood that another day of silence would only become another day of unanswered questions. They quietly whispered a prayer for wisdom, took a deep breath, and decided that truth was worth more than comfort. The first message they wrote was long. It contained every emotion they had carried for months, every apology they wished they had spoken sooner, and every hope they had hidden behind silence. Then they paused, read it again, and slowly erased most of it. They realized that genuine honesty does not require perfect words. It requires a sincere heart. In the end, they sent a simple message expressing gratitude, humility, and a desire for an honest conversation whenever the other person felt ready. There were no dramatic promises, no attempts to create guilt, and no pressure for an immediate reply. Only kindness, respect, and the courage to finally stop hiding. As the message disappeared from the screen, an unexpected feeling settled over them. They had imagined they would feel overwhelming fear, but instead they experienced peace. In this fictional story, they understood God's guidance not as certainty about the outcome but as the quiet assurance that living truthfully is always better than living behind fear. Whether the response arrived in minutes, days, or even weeks no longer mattered as much as it once had. They had finally chosen integrity over hesitation, and that choice alone lifted a burden they had carried for far too long. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional center of this fictional story unfolds here. On the other side, the message arrived during an ordinary afternoon. The other person was not expecting it. They looked at the screen several times before opening it. Old memories immediately returned, not only the difficult ones but also the joyful moments they had almost forgotten. They remembered conversations that lasted late into the night, moments of encouragement during hard seasons, shared laughter over simple things, and the quiet understanding that once existed between them. Instead of reacting quickly, they placed the phone beside them and spent time reflecting. They wanted any response they gave to come from wisdom rather than emotion, from peace rather than impulse. As evening approached, both hearts found themselves looking toward the same sunset from different places. The sky was filled with breathtaking colors, and the stillness reminded them that healing is rarely rushed. They understood that meaningful conversations deserve patience. They no longer wanted to repeat old patterns of misunderstanding or fear. If they were going to speak again, they wanted their words to reflect everything they had learned during the long season of silence. Every difficult chapter had taught them to listen more carefully, forgive more freely, and appreciate honesty far more than assumptions. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares one of its greatest lessons. Sometimes the most courageous act is not receiving the answer we hope for. Sometimes it is simply choosing to speak with sincerity while releasing the outcome with trust. Hearts become lighter when they stop carrying the weight of unspoken words. Relationships become healthier when people choose respectful communication instead of fearful avoidance. Even when the future remains unknown, honesty plants seeds that fear never can. As night gave way to another peaceful sunrise, the person who had received the message quietly smiled. After taking time to reflect, they opened their phone once more and began typing a thoughtful reply. There was no anger in their heart, no desire to revisit old arguments, and no intention of assigning blame. Instead, there was gratitude for the courage it had taken to reach out and a willingness to have the conversation that both hearts had postponed for far too long. Before pressing send, they paused for one final moment, hoping their words would bring peace, understanding, and healing rather than reopening old wounds. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal the conversation both hearts had quietly prayed would one day become possible. The silence had finally been broken, not through dramatic declarations, but through humility, patience, and truth. The first words had been spoken. The first step had been taken. And as another beautiful morning spread its light across the earth, both hearts stood on the threshold of a new beginning. One built not upon fear, but upon honesty, compassion, faith, and the quiet courage to truly listen. My beloved child, don't skip these final words, because every chapter of this fictional story has been leading to this moment. Listen carefully, because the silence that once seemed endless was never the true end of the story. It became the place where two hearts learned patience, humility, forgiveness, and the courage to grow. They had both traveled through seasons of uncertainty, moments of regret, and long nights filled with unanswered questions. Yet those difficult chapters had quietly shaped them into people who were finally ready to communicate with honesty instead of fear. As the first rays of the morning sun stretched across the horizon, the long-awaited conversation finally began. There were no dramatic speeches or impossible promises. Instead, there were sincere words spoken with kindness and respect. They listened to one another without interrupting. They admitted mistakes without making excuses. They thanked each other for the lessons they had learned, even through the difficult seasons. For the first time in a very long while, both hearts felt truly heard. The silence that had once created distance was replaced by understanding, and the weight they had carried for so many months slowly disappeared. One person quietly said, "I spent so much time believing silence would protect us, but all it did was keep me from saying the things my heart had wanted to say." The other smiled gently and replied, "We cannot change yesterday, but we can choose how we move forward today." Those simple words brought more healing than either of them expected. They realized that honest conversations do not erase the past, but they can create a healthier future built upon trust, compassion, and mutual respect. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because it carries the deepest lesson of this fictional story. In this story, what they experienced as God's promise was not that every relationship would unfold exactly as they once imagined. It was the quiet assurance that hearts willing to choose forgiveness, truth, humility, and love are never changed in vain. Whether people are reunited or peacefully move forward on different paths, choosing honesty instead of fear brings freedom. The greatest miracle was not controlling the outcome, it was allowing kindness to guide every decision. As the days passed, both lives continued moving forward with renewed peace. They no longer carried resentment. They no longer allowed regret to define their future. Instead, they focused on becoming people who encouraged others, strengthened their families, served their communities, and lived each day with gratitude. Every sunrise reminded them that each new beginning is an invitation to love more deeply, forgive more freely, and appreciate the people around them while there is still time. Looking back over the entire journey, they understood that every difficult season had served a purpose. The waiting had produced patience. The silence had taught reflection. The setbacks had strengthened resilience. The unanswered questions had deepened wisdom. Nothing had been wasted. Even the hardest chapters had become stepping stones toward greater compassion and stronger character. They discovered that peace is not found in having every answer. It is found in living each day with integrity, hope, and a heart open to growth. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story leaves behind one final truth. Real love is never sustained by fear, pressure, or unrealistic expectations. It grows where people choose honest communication, mutual respect, forgiveness, and consistent acts of kindness. Every meaningful relationship flourishes when both hearts continue learning, serving, and encouraging one another through every changing season of life. That is the kind of love that endures long after excitement fades. As evening arrived, they stood beneath a sky glowing with brilliant shades of gold and crimson. They smiled, not because life had become perfect, but because they had become stronger, wiser, and more grateful than they had ever been before. They understood that every chapter, whether joyful or painful, had led them toward becoming better human beings. The future no longer frightened them because they had learned that hope is renewed each day through faithful choices and compassionate actions. My beloved child, remember these final words as this fictional journey comes to its close. Never let fear keep kindness unspoken. Never let pride become louder than compassion. Never assume that silence is always the safest path when truth can bring healing. Continue choosing honesty, patience, humility, and hope. Those quiet decisions shape a life filled with lasting peace. And so, as one final sunrise filled the earth with warm golden light, they stepped forward with grateful hearts. The silence had ended, but something even greater had begun. They carried no bitterness into tomorrow, only wisdom from yesterday and hope for the future. Their journey ended with two hearts transformed by faith, strengthened by forgiveness, guided by truth, and committed to living each new day with courage and compassion. As they walked toward the horizon together, they understood that the greatest gift was never simply finding each other again. It was becoming the kind of people who could bring light, peace, and love wherever life would lead them. And with that quiet realization, a beautiful new chapter began.